Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Baird. I'm the Special Projects Coordinator here at the Linen Hall. If you haven't had a chance already to look at the exhibition is available, begins on the ground floor right up to the 4th floor, if you do have a chance for that. Additionally, we have available on our website a way in which that participants can contribute their own stories about experiences and attitudes towards borders and boundaries in Northern Ireland and around Northern Ireland. So if you head to our website, linenhall.com, you'll find more information available there. There are the men's toilets available on this floor. The code is 4959. The women's toilets are just directly below, so they're on the 2nd floor. The 1st floor, and the code is the same, 4959. Could you just ask that you check your phone is on silent? And then I will hand you over to our much esteemed chair, Gemma Reid.
Much esteemed. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest in a fascinating programme of events with an attached exhibition curated by Melissa on borders and boundaries. Once again, a really engaged programme of activities from the Linen Hall Library, reflecting on the past and connecting it with the present and what our next steps into the future might be. And although I haven't managed to get to any of the other events, sadly, maybe some of you have, it's been really interesting to see the mixture of different takes on borders and partitions that the Linen Hall Library has curated here, between politics and sport and activism. Today we have two wonderful guest speakers who are taking a different perspective on borders and boundaries than our previous events, one as a historian and one as a cultural geographer and writer and artist. And we'll get to them shortly. First of all, I think I will introduce Dr Cormac, who is historian in residence at Dublin City Council, which I'm fascinated by as a role. I think that's something we should emulate in the North as well, having a historian residence in our local councils. He's a regular contributor to the Irish News and author of The Birth of the Border, The Impact of Partition in Ireland, as well as the Irish soccer split. And I have to say, as a non-football fan in any way, shape or form, I still find that split really fascinating. He's also currently working with Professor Katie Hayward on a forthcoming book called Checks and Controls, The Entangled History and Future of Ireland's Borders. So really joining past and present there to look at how land and sea borders have affected Ireland, island-wide, from partition to the present day. So his research examines impact of partition on people's daily lives on both sides of the border and demonstrates that what happens at the political and legal level has a complex and sometimes unexpected relationship with what happens in the social and cultural sphere in ordinary people's lives. So he's going to talk today about the impact on people's lives in the kind of generation immediately after partition and leading up into the middle of the 20th century. So would you like to take the stand? Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. So pictured are some images from an article in the Irish Times from June 1947 entitled One Town in Two States. It looks at the town of Petticoat, which straddles the border between Donegal in Ireland and Fermanagh in Northern Ireland. The River Termon that runs through it acts as the boundary line between both jurisdictions. With the creation of the border in 1921, and particularly with the imposition of customs barriers in 1923, the day-to-day effects of partition were keenly felt by residents of the town, residents from both sides of the border. As the Irish Times article claims, cigarettes were cheaper on the Donegal side, while sugar was cheaper in Fermanagh. Protestant children from Fermanagh still crossed the river to get to school, while many went the other way at night, where closing times in pubs were later. If you wanted to catch a train, which you could do so in Petticoat until 1957, you needed to go to the Donegal side of the town, regardless of which side of the border you lived on. Crossing the border often meant lengthy delays for customs checks on both sides of the border, while people like those in Petticoat, living directly on the boundary line, experienced the most profound changes to their daily lives with the onset of partition. The division of Ireland impacted on everyone and every organisation on the island. In this talk, I will look at some of the day-to-day effects of partition in and around the time of the birth of the Irish border. Instead of focusing on the political and political violence perspectives which have dominated studies on partition previously, I will look at how partition impacted on business and trade, on infrastructure and services, on the law, on the religion and education, on the labour movement, and finally on sporting bodies. The partition of Ireland coincided with prolonged periods of economic stagnation and decline for both Irish jurisdictions. During the interwar period, economic depression prevailed, forcing thousands into unemployment and emigration. Northern Ireland was hard hit by recessions in its traditional industries, shipbuilding, linen and agriculture. For the linen industry, this decline was permanent. There was little effort to cooperate economically with each other during this period. Iterations of Sinn Féin introduced measures that guaranteed a divergence between both jurisdictions on trade, with its Belfast boycott campaign from 1920 and the Irish Free State's introduction of customs barriers in 1923. The expulsion of Catholic workers from shipyards and other places of work and the sectarian violence in the North saw Sinn Féin make one of its first decisions directly relating to the North. It started a boycott. Dáil Éireann imposed a boycott of goods from Belfast and a withdrawal of funds from Belfast-based banks. In reality, the boycott soon extended to other businesses and farming and beyond Belfast too. Many saw it as an anti-partitionist move, a way to show that Northern Ireland could not survive without the rest of Ireland. The boycott involved members of the IRA intercepting and destroying products that originated in the North East, and southern traders were banned from doing business with their northern counterparts. And here are some images of 3 tonnes of tobacco leaf assigned to Belfast firms, which were thrown into the Liffey River by the IRA. To prevent goods from entering regions, trains were also raided by the IRA. Sinn Féin claimed the boycott was achieving results. Many wholesale firms declared they were badly hit, losing 75% of their trade outside of Ulster. Northern salespeople on the road frequently returned with no orders. Joseph McDonagh, the boycott director, boasted that except in Antrim and Down, it was impossible for a Belfast merchant to sell as much as a bootlace in any other part of Ireland. Ulster traders responded by forming a group, the Ulster Traders Defence Association, to impose a counter-boycott. Ulster people were urged not to buy any southern goods, clothing, meat, butter, biscuits, furniture, stout and whisky. Economically, the boycott had a negative impact on trade in Belfast and other areas in the north of Ireland. In all probability, Belfast trade with the south never recovered to its pre-boycott level, halved by 1924. The boycott also had a negative economic effect on those imposing it, resulting in goods costing more to the consumer and diminished profits for traders. Northern-based banks such as Ulster Bank, Northern Bank and Belfast Bank saw business reduced, with deposits down and sub-branches having to close in the south. Here's an Ulster Bank building in Waterford. The Belfast Bank lost 1/5 of its deposits outside of Northern Ireland and decided to close all of its southern branches in 1923. The boycott had minimal impact on its 3 main industries though, agriculture, shipbuilding and linen, as they mainly supplied to international markets. Sinn Féin member and Ulster-born Protestant Ernest Bly claimed the boycott would threaten the northern shipbuilding industry no more than a summer shower would threaten Cave Hill. While its economic effects to hamper trade in Belfast met with mixed results, the boycott's aim to unify Ireland was an unmitigated disaster. It resulted in further psychological and physical divisions between North and South, some that had never existed before. Another step of the Irish Free State government in February 1923 had arguably the biggest impact in cementing partition, the imposition of customs barriers on imported goods. The creation of a customs barrier was key in translating partition into a reality. It did so in a bid to achieve fiscal independence from Britain and to generate revenue for the Exchequer. It was also an attempt to apply economic pressure on the nascent Northern Ireland jurisdiction. In announcing the imposition, the Free State government stated that pending a decision as to the future boundary line, a temporary frontier will be placed along the boundary line between the 6 northern and 26 southern counties. This temporary frontier on imported goods lasted for over 70 years, only rescinded due to the introduction of the single market throughout the European Union in 1993. The decision to introduce customs barriers was announced in late February 1923, to be enacted just weeks later on 1st of April, leaving very little time for people and businesses to prepare. The arrangements were agreed between the Free State Government and the British Government, not the Northern Administration, who had no control over customs and excise. In practical terms, the importing and exporting of merchandise across the border was prohibited except through designated routes and at designated times. Stations were open for the clearance of merchandise between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. daily, except on Sundays and public holidays. Cross-border roads were designated as authorised concession or unauthorised, unapproved. Many unapproved roads were earmarked for closure. Some roads using explosives were cratered and made impassable. Every railway line crossing the border was approved for importation and exportation of merchandise. Although there was free movement of people across the border, those who crossed had their person and personal effects examined to prevent smuggling. There was widespread disapproval of the decision north and south, particularly from those closest to the border. It was generally felt that the new customs barrier would lead to an increased cost of living for consumers, considerable confusion and lengthy delays in the handling of traffic. The Northern Ireland Prime Minister James Craig called for the Free State to postpone for all time a customs barrier, claiming those in the south who proposed to erect that barrier wall, and not the north, would be responsible for partition. There was no such thing as partition if they had not a customs barrier between the north and the south. As 1st of April drew closer, the physical signs of the new measures began to appear. Declaration forms were issued at railway stations, proclamations appeared in newspapers, signs and posters displayed in prominent places. Construction began on customs huts and stations along the border, many of them temporary in nature initially. As well as being April Fool's Day, 1st of April 1923 was Easter Sunday, the day the new customs barrier came into operation. Traffic was light, little disruption was caused by the new measures. A man who declared he had nothing to declare in Dundalk was subsequently found to have in his possession a box of 100 cigarettes. He was duly warned of the grave nature of his offence and told not to do it again. Another merchant caused some amusement when he had to undo a bale of ladies' underwear in front of passing onlookers. And here's some of the action around that time. Once the Easter break was over, the real effects of the customs barrier began to be realised. The new arrangements led to increased congestion at ports and border controls, with goods awaiting a clearance, leading to heavy losses and disruption to businesses. It did result in the closure of some border companies reliant on cross-border trade. The consequences of the new measures were most keenly felt by the border counties, Donegal economically cut off from Derry, Down from Louth. Although both jurisdictions opted for a relatively open border with no barbed wire entanglement to seal their frontier, it severely curtailed the movement of residents along the border. Railway services suffered considerable disruptions, with some lines zigzagging the border on numerous occasions. Customs examinations initially expected for each crossing. A train running from Clonus to Cavan crossed the border 6 times in 8 miles. Common sense soon prevailed, and it was decided to curb the examinations to just the first point of entry beyond the border. The trade barriers introduced in 1923 had a negative impact on trade between North and South, but less than popular perceptions have contended. Trade had always been more reliant on East-West trade, Britain, rather than North-South trade. Border counties and towns were more affected than others, though. Those counties and towns grew less than they should have historically because of the border. Undoubtedly, the introduction of the customs barrier helped to cement partition. Up to this point, partition was seen by many as just an administrative burden. It hardly impacted on the daily lives of people. The introduction of customs barriers made it tangible, made it real. Movement and trade were now curtailed across the border, impeding long-established economic and social ties. It formalised the border, making it easy for the Boundary Commission to retain the status quo in 1925. Businesses, trade associations and charities were all impacted by the partition of Ireland. In Cormac O'Grada and Brendan M. Walsh's study of the economic impact of the border in 2006, Did and Does the Irish Border Matter? They claim it did, but less than popular perceptions imply. The largest industry in Ireland, agriculture, had worked effectively under an all-Ireland agriculture department before partition. Even though the department was divided, responsibilities for fisheries and the administration of the Diseases of Animals Acts were reserved for the Council of Ireland under the Government of Ireland Act 1920. The department was a particularly complex one, making it extremely difficult to divide. According to the department, there were examples where the staffs are not interchangeable, in some instances consisting of one specialist only. By and large, problems were overcome, and both departments, North and South, did learn to cooperate with each other in areas of common interest, such as disease control. In a rare occurrence, both agriculture ministers met in 1926 to discuss areas of common concern. You can see here the Minister of Agriculture from the North and South, Edward Archdale, and Patrick Hogan meeting in Dublin. A peculiar aspect of partition in Ireland, compared to other divided jurisdictions, is the number of organisations who have chosen to ignore it. Many business, trade and charity groups formed before 1921 remained all-Ireland bodies, including unionist-leaning ones. There was no compunction or obligation for most organisations to follow suit once the new international frontier was created with the partition of Ireland. With the confusing nature of partition, the uncertainty surrounding its viability, it is little wonder that most bodies remained all-Ireland entities. Retaining all-Ireland structures was also a feature within many sporting bodies, trade unions and religious organisations. By drawing a line and creating a physical border spanning almost 300 miles, some of the most challenging issues faced by both jurisdictions after partition related to infrastructure and service-based issues. Even after 1925, when many believed the border area was settled, concerns relating to the railway infrastructure, the territorial ownership of bodies of water and the postal services demonstrated the uncertain and confusing nature of partition. The complexity of the railway infrastructure and ownership within Ireland was compounded dramatically by the creation of a border. 5 railway companies were directly affected by the new border by serving both sides of it. This was further exacerbated by the Free State's decision to impose a customs barrier in 1923. Both Irish governments agreed in 1924 that the Free State would legislate for railway companies based solely in the Free State territory, and the Northern Government would not look to amalgamate railway companies in Northern Ireland with British ones. Cross-border cooperation was harder won on the issue of fishing rights on Lough and River Foyle. Disputes over fishing on the Foyle spanned for 3 decades after partition. The disputes showed a haphazard way in which the border was drawn up. No boundary was delimited at any point for either Lough Foyle or Lough Carlingford. Nobody knew where the border line was on various waterways straddling the border as a result. The postal services were, like the railways, a reserved service under the Government of Ireland Act 1920. With the Anglo-Irish Treaty overriding the Government of Ireland Act for the 26 counties, the Irish Free State took control of its postal services, while the Imperial Parliament in Westminster retained control of the postal services for Northern Ireland. The Northern Government found it very hard to assert its independence from the rest of Ireland on the issue of postal services. Its dependence on cooperating with the Free State included residents in border areas in the north being reliant on Free State post offices to deliver their mail, sensitive mail for security forces being routed through Free State post offices, and mail from Britain being delivered via the Holyhead-Dunleary route to different locales in Northern Ireland. The impact of partition on the infrastructure of the island of Ireland and the services that had served it on an all-Ireland basis beforehand showed the scale of the changes needed to create a border. The confusion and uncertainty that such a cleavage caused was aptly demonstrated by the effects it had on railways, fisheries and postal services. This was further amplified by the different political statuses of both Irish jurisdictions. Customs, practices and services had to be changed overnight to accommodate 2 political jurisdictions instead of 1. In some instances where economic sense prevailed, as with postal routes and the Erne hydroelectric scheme, it was possible to achieve cooperation between both entities eventually. In other cases, the psychological partition was too difficult to overcome, with both jurisdictions growing further and further apart from each other. Arguably, nothing demonstrated the complexity of creating a border jurisdiction from scratch more so than the law. Under the Government of Ireland Act 1920, the judiciary of Ireland was divided into 2 judiciaries, North and South. There was also a counter-system of justice in place, the Republican or Dáil courts, when Ireland was partitioned. While a Free State was presented with most aspects of a functioning legal system, Northern Ireland was faced with a gargantuan task of creating a whole new justice system for a new entity. The person chosen to be the first Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland was a Catholic, Sir Denis Henry. While Henry was a Catholic, he was not a nationalist, holding a truly unique position by being a Catholic Ulster Unionist MP before he was appointed as Lord Chief Justice. He was faced with the unenviable task of ensuring the judiciary and official appointments, as well as a functioning justice system, were in place. He also had to secure a building as a courthouse. The government purchased the site of the old potato market, and it was here that the new law courts opened in 1933. For the 12 years before the permanent courthouse was built, it was necessary to use temporary accommodation. The Antrim County Courthouse on the Crumlin Road in Belfast was chosen as the best option available at the time. The Government of Ireland Act 1920 had practically severed the Bar of Ireland into two bodies, but all the then existing members of the Bar had the right of audience in both areas of Ireland preserved to them. One of those was Frances Kyle, the first woman to be called to the Irish Bar in November 1921. Kyle was immediately followed by Avril Deverill on the same day. Both women made headlines around the world for being the first women to be called to the bar in Britain or Ireland. That day was also the first call of a divided Irish bar. Kyle, originally from Belfast, pursued her professional career in Northern Ireland, while Deverill from Greystones and Wicklow pursued her career in the South. Kyle, like all other students from Northern Ireland at this time, still had to study at the King's Inns in Dublin to qualify as a barrister. This arrangement continued until 1925. Reconciling two distinct political and judicial entities under the King's Inns umbrella proved difficult, and strains started to show. The Northern Committee of King's Inns was irked that some in the South were exempt from taking examinations for war services, as the war service in question was in some instances in the forces opposed to the Crown. Those exempted included Kevin O'Higgins, Minister for Justice in the Free State. King's Inns ignored the Northern Committee's threats to leave and even inflamed the situation by proposing that Irish should be a compulsory language for a call to the Irish Bar. The Northern Bar decided to sever connections and subsequently established an Inns of Court of Northern Ireland, which was inaugurated at the Belfast Law Courts on 11th of January 1926. The main common link between both Irish justice systems was now broken. The spectre of partition posed vast problems and some opportunities for the Catholic Church and the main Protestant denominations. With the partition of Ireland, the Catholic Church saw itself receiving the best and worst of outcomes with the creation of both jurisdictions. It went on to exert huge control over the Irish Free State on the one hand, and became the main voice for the significant but powerless minority in Northern Ireland on the other. There was never a question of the Catholic Church dividing itself along partitionist lines. It remained an all-Ireland body. The primate of all Ireland was the Archbishop of Armagh, and as a body, the whole hierarchy in Ireland met regularly. In fact, of all organisations that were all-Ireland bodies before partition, religious ones had the highest number that remained so afterwards. With the partitioning of Ireland, the three main Protestant churches retained their all-Ireland structures. In 1920, the primate of the Church of Ireland, Charles Frederick Darcy, emphatically declared that he did not believe that the creation of an administrative boundary would lead to a corresponding division in the Church. If it did, it would be proof of a very feeble, flickering life in the Church. Even though the majority of Church of Ireland members resided in Northern Ireland, the machinery of the Church remained largely based in the South. The one religion in Ireland that saw the greatest institutional changes due to partition was Judaism. It was no longer organised on an all-Ireland basis. Both Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State were able to show greater scope for separate expressions of how education was to be run in a divided rather than a united country. Such separate expressions were clearly demonstrated in the very different approaches taken on education within both jurisdictions. Whereas Northern Ireland, with Lord Londonderry as Minister of Education, introduced wide-ranging changes that essentially sought to democratise education, the South imposed minimal structural reforms but fundamentally changed the education system in its attempt to Gaelicise Ireland. And here's a new school being officially opened in Belfast in 1925. The divergence in paths was also clearly illustrated by the obstructionist tactics of the South, who refused to recognise the Northern jurisdiction, and the failure of both entities to cooperate on areas of common interest, such as teacher training and examinations. The Labour movement was also faced with many challenges when the country was partitioned. The movement included a divergent group of people who had to operate under enormous sectarian and political pressures. Belfast Labour candidates who ran as independents in the 1921 election to the Northern Ireland Parliament folded their campaign once loyalists prevented them from holding an election rally in the Ulster Hall. The Irish Labour movement was not a homogeneous group, with many Protestants and Catholics, Unionists and Nationalists, as well as socialist internationalists, a delicate juggling act was required within the political party and the trade unions after the onset of partition. The Labour movement in the North sought to avoid contention and remained united by focusing on labour and trade union issues, on wages and conditions for workers. With a mainly Protestant anti-unionist leadership and a mainly Protestant unionist membership, mutually dependent for their bread and butter, but otherwise at odds, they found themselves walking a tight line between their organisational interests and the politics of their members. The issue of social reform kept them united. With such divergent views on partition, the topic was avoided as often as possible. The Irish Trades Union Congress, ITUC, remained an all-Ireland body, primarily because there was no feasible alternative in the North and there was little interest in forming an Ulster Trades Union Congress. William O'Brien, General Secretary of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, emphasised in 1925 the fact that the working class in Ireland recognises no political or geographical border. Partition prevails almost exclusively in the political sphere. Recognising that its trade unions and members based in Northern Ireland needed to be treated differently, a Northern Ireland Committee of the ITUC was established to speak for all trade unions in the North and all trade unionists. The Labour movement achieved partial union, particularly within trade unionism, by clinging to core interests within the movement and by offering a large degree of autonomy to Northern Labour activists. The political partition of the island posed problems for all sporting bodies in Ireland too. The border forced all sports to look at their internal governance structures. Unlike in soccer and athletics and cycling, most Irish governing bodies managed to maintain unity through considerable compromise, as issues of political symbolism were tailored to accommodate diverse political and cultural interests. There was a readiness from many sporting bodies to incorporate inoffensive and neutral flags, anthems and emblems, such as the Four Provinces flag, to maintain unity. Great efforts were also made to democratise the internal governance structures of those sports. Most sports that remained united also did not have the identity issues faced by sports like soccer. Sports such as rugby, hockey, cricket, tennis and bowls were primarily to preserve of Protestants from the upper classes of society. The GAA is a pan-nationalist association dominated by Catholics, did little to encourage Protestant and Unionist membership. Soccer, like athletics and cycling, had to cater for different religions and classes, which contributed to divisions within those sports. This talk has shown how matters of state policy impacted on people and the organisations they were involved in. It is clear that there were a lot more complexity, ambiguity and flexibility during this period than simplistic narratives of the past recall. By focusing on the lived experience of people and organisations at the time, we can see that the political and legal partition of Ireland was not followed by a social and cultural partition. Given the piecemeal and haphazard implementation of partition, it was only natural that there would be a myriad of reactions, counter-reactions and interactions from people and organisations. Generally, the Northern Government gave no political direction on what path organisations themselves should take once Ireland was partitioned. Although the Northern Government sought as little cooperation with the Irish Free State as possible, an anomalous position existed whereby unionist politicians such as Thomas Moles and John Andrews sought as much divergence politically between the North and the South on the one hand and actively sought unity in sport on the other. Overall, organisations in Ireland were not subsumed by the iron grip of the nation state and generally chose to pursue their own path in the interests of their members in pursuit of their own local interests. If you want to find out more, the shameful plug you can find out more about all these topics covered in my book, Birth of the Border. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Cormac. That was quite a whirlwind tour through a wide range of issues and aspects of people's lives. We're going to move quickly on then to Bryonie's presentation so that we can leave some time at the end for questions from the audience. Bryonie is a cultural geographer and writer and artist, and also my sister, who I have had the pleasure of working with for the last 10 years and learned a great deal from her about perspectives on place and identity. She is the joint author of Partitioned Lives, The Irish Borderlands, which was published in 2016. And so today she's going to share with us some aspects of the interviews, oral history interviews that she did with people along the border area during that research, who shared with her stories and reflections about their experiences of the border from the 1950s to the present day.
Thanks, Gemma. So my understanding of the meaning and the impact of the border beyond my own personal experience comes from this project that Gemma mentioned. So I spent 2 years as a research associate on a project called Irish Borderlands, which was run by Ulster University and Queen Mary University of London. And that was 16 or 17 years ago now. So within the project team, I was responsible for gathering oral histories, which would help us understand and share a range of lived experiences of the border mostly in the 20th, some stories from the early 21st century. So I ended up meeting and listening to 80 people who consented for me to record their memories, their stories, their thoughts about the border. And that was on both sides of the border along the whole length. I found it a really deeply impactful process. I'd grown up near Belfast, and when I started this project, I had only recently moved to a border area myself in the Republic of Ireland. So everything I was hearing kind of acquired an extra dimension for me as I was working out how to navigate the border in my own everyday life. I'd just finished my PhD as well, and I was aware that it would take some mental and physical effort to incorporate this kind of research into my practice, stepping outside of libraries and archives and moving around and meeting people and hearing from people. But I also knew I found it a really stimulating and really rewarding part of research. So this project really started me off on a process of learning how to listen and understanding why I might want to listen, that continues today and really forms the core of the work that I do with Gemma in Quarto Collective. So as I travelled along the border, I was meeting my interviewees, listening to them, recording them, transcribing what they said to me, and then writing summaries of these stories for myself and for project colleagues. The stories really became a very defined collection for me, which I felt I was carrying and holding, and I continue to carry and hold, and all the stories are really vivid, the details are still vivid. So it really feels like a privilege to have been trusted with all of that. And what I'm going to share with you today is really only provisionally mine to pass on with the permission of these interviewees, who in many instances were really brave actually to share the stories they did, and very generous in allowing us to talk about them publicly, ongoingly. So obviously the border is just more than 100 years old now, and the last 10 years have not been the least eventful in its history. And my research, because it took place 16, 17 years ago, it doesn't include the impact of Brexit, and also even the dawning prospect that we have now of a border referendum within our lifetimes. But it does offer a sense of what the border meant and how it was experienced through stories that touch on almost every decade of the 20th century and dwell at length on the last kind of 50, 60 years. In talking to Melissa and Cormac and Gemma about how this panel discussion might shape up, the idea of identity came up. And since I'm bringing stories as opposed to the kind of in-depth historical research that Cormac presents, I thought I would give you a sense of how living on the border affected the identities of two of my interviewees, according to what they told me. I'll flick through some images as I'm talking. They are photographs and prints and drawings that are part of a body of artwork that I've been making over the years about the border, and a few photographs from project colleagues as well on Irish Borderlands. So the first interview I'm going to talk about is Kenny. Kenny was born into a Protestant family living on the city side in Derry. They holidayed in Portrush. He says that Donegal felt very much like a foreign country. He remembers going once with the family of a Catholic school friend and sitting on a beach wondering, was he the only Protestant in the whole county? Of course he wasn't, but as a child that's what he felt. He really felt himself as different. In 1969 then, as violence began to break out and took hold in those first few years that became the Troubles, his dominant memory is a sense of threat. So living on the city side in Derry, very conscious of what was happening in the Catholic community that surrounded him, and the rumours actually that the Irish army was gathering on the border ready to invade. Kenny kind of had that as a big kind of looming bogeyman in his childhood, and eventually the family felt unsafe enough to move out of Derry and onto the east bank of the Foyle. Kenny told me that his grandfather was a musician, though, and, you know, although coming from this Protestant background, played Irish traditional instruments and Irish traditional airs, and he was part of a céilíoing tradition in his own community. And this was a big part of his grandfather's identity, but as the Troubles deepened and escalated, his grandfather dropped it all, and Kenny remembers that being a really sad thing in the family, sad for his grandfather and sad for all of them. But that idea of a cultural commons that was shared on the island really came to mean something else for his grandfather. And as Kenny puts it, all of a sudden people had to become British. So there was a sense of being able to have more than one identity, or have identities that merged into each other, but with the ongoing violence, that those had to come apart and kind of crystallise and be different from each other. For Kenny himself, as a young adult, actually folk music was the means by which his identity ended up expanding. So he was a big fan of a folk band called Goats Don't Shave. And he said to me that after 1994 and the ceasefires, they were gigging all around Donegal for a certain period of time, and he just followed them because he was living in the neighbouring county and he could go to lots of gigs. And he got used to being in Donegal, and he was surprised to find that when he was at the gig or when he was in a bar, nobody inquired or cared or seemed to identify him as a Protestant. He was just a northerner, and they were also northerners. Nobody was interested in the religious or political context in that context that Kenny was in. So he started to feel at home. He started to feel confident about travelling over to buy cheaper fuel and to take day trips with his family. So didn't just have to go to Portrush, they could also go west. And then as the peace process got underway and the border checkpoints disappeared, that removed another barrier, and those had not just been a physical barrier, there'd obviously been psychological barrier as well. So Kenny said actually at this point then he felt comfortable enough in Donegal that crossing what really was still an international border was much easier for him than crossing all the multiple internal borders that he perceived in his area. So the border that might have stopped him going back into the city side of Derry, or a border that might have stopped him going into Strabane, again obviously not physical but psychological only in those cases. Then in the early 2000s, he took part in a training for transformation programme, which was specifically about bringing together Protestants from the east and west banks of the Foyle, so Protestants from Donegal with Protestants from County Derry, County Londonderry. And Kenny was again actually surprised, and unfortunately unpleasantly surprised in this case, to realise that there was a sense of mutual distrust, even though people were co-religionists, that there was a sense of distance and even sometimes suspicion, and he described that as the biggest shock to his system. And he kind of talked then about how in that area the river had really effectively divided communities on either side of the border. So customs had been a factor, the Troubles became probably a more significant factor in removing boat traffic, and where people would have once crossed the river quite freely and intermarried and socialised and gone to church and gone to school on both sides, that had all been disintegrating for several decades, and during the Troubles definitely just a complete barrier. So he attributed that sense of distance really to the way that the river could impose an absolute break. It didn't happen maybe in other parts of the border that went across land. But then with peace and with time and through programmes like the one he was involved in, connections were being re-established, and he mentions one of the big kind of icebreakers was realising that everybody was using the same colloquialisms and the same type of language, and that felt like, you know, some basis on which to start to rebuild relationship. So, like in Kenny's entire story that he told me, he really ended by saying that he had been identifying primarily as a northerner for some years, so not as a Protestant, not as a unionist, not Northern Irish, not British, not Irish. Those might all be parts of his identity, but his primary identity he felt was as a northerner, and feeling that everybody and anybody living in the northern part of the island of Ireland had something in common and some basis on which to connect and feel a sameness with each other, in contrast maybe to people who were living further south. So the second story I'm going to share came from Aegon, who was born into a Catholic family in Coot Hill in northeast Cavan in the mid-1950s. And he talked to me in our conversation about the shift in identity that took place in and around Coot Hill itself in relation to the border, but more as a place identity than a personal identity. And he also stressed that the shift resulting from partition itself was initially small, which I think Cormac's talk also really drew out, but it deepened over time then in response to a few other factors. So those national and global economic flows that were happening, the shutting down of the railway system, which was a big thing for nearly all of my interviewees who were born and remembered, born before the 1950s. And then the escalating violence of the Troubles, which was another, obviously, a very, very big factor in people's experiences. So Aegon explained that his family had kept a country shop just outside of Coot Hill and had really extensive records, and he was able to look back and know that in his grandfather's time and before his grandfather's time, trade happened between Coot Hill and Belfast. The wholesalers and the suppliers were all flowing in those directions. He mentioned that linen had been produced in that area for a long time, so that would have really established and consolidated a connection with Belfast as well. And then if people from Coot Hill needed to move outside the area to work in service or in industry, they went to Belfast. The clergy serving in all of the churches were coming in from Belfast, and those rail links made all that toing and froing really easy. So it connected Coot Hill with Belfast, but also Coot Hill with Newry and Armagh, Enniskillen and Monaghan and Castleblaney. So this kind of a little geography and then a bigger geography that all was looking north and northeast, maybe a little bit west, but always north. So in this part of Cavan, he said, people really considered their natural neighbours to be Armagh, Monaghan and Fermanagh, and Westmeath may have been in the Free State with Cavan or in the Republic of Ireland with Cavan, but it was different. And Aegon says that northeast Cavan had what he calls a fierce, strong sense of Ulsterness. So another feature of Ulsterness that Aegon noted and valued in Coot Hill was really its Protestant diversity, and he listed 7 different Protestant churches that were in the town in his childhood. So he told me there's a Church of Ireland, Presbyterian, Covenant or Presbyterian, Methodist, Primitive Methodist, Quaker and Moravian, and he was really proud of this. All of these communities had they had close links with Belfast, and that really strengthened the connections in that direction as well. But he was saying to me this range of Protestant affiliation just isn't present in most of the Republic of Ireland. And he said, and I'm quoting, in me that they're either Church of Ireland or Catholic, there wouldn't even be a Presbyterian in it. So he really liked this. It was another feature of Ulsterness, as I said. So in Coot Hill, and Aegon referenced his grandfather's records as a way of understanding this, that with partition people had to reorient themselves to an extent, and it kind of happened gradually. But he points out that for his grandfather, he could get on a train in Coot Hill and go in a very simple straight line to Belfast, but to get to Dublin was a day's work, and he went through the changes and, different country platforms that you'd have to get out at and get another train and change on Dundalk and so on. But then because travel over the border became more and more difficult over time, Aegon's father's, the big town that he would have gone to was Dublin in the end. Cormac mentioned about railway companies closing their lines and station from the mid-1950s onwards, and that way in which the border formed a very wriggly line in lots of places, and trains crossing and recrossing the border several times in the course of a few minutes made that kind of more difficult. And again, as Cormac has mentioned, Aegon talked about like walking across the border on the informal crossings was pretty simple, although you would have to be very careful about what you were carrying or assume that you'd be able to evade any customs patrols. But then going across by car was another matter, and there was various papers and documents you had to have with you, and police and customs checkpoints could be unpleasant places to go through as well. But then the violence that arose and intensified across Northern Ireland in the late 60s and into the 70s, 80s and 90s just made the border more and more difficult to cross. So There were lots of roads cratered to stop people getting vehicles over. It could also prevent you from walking over, depending on how the crater had gone. The military checkpoints then caused lots of delays, and there was this palpable sense of fear and threat for almost everybody going across it. So as Egon put it, the border wasn't friendly, and the networks that crossed it began to fragment. And identities around Coot Hill that had seemed kind of unified and self-evident started becoming uneasy and uncertain. Egon talked about the coziness that Protestant and Catholic neighbours would have felt with each other, but that this began to be darkened by suspicion and a tension that came into the air. So I think the sense that as news came in from the north and as incidents also happened in the Republic of this or that, bomb or shooting, the sense that loyalties and opinions on that might be quite different between you and your neighbour in fundamental and really meaningful ways, because there's almost a sense of preemptive hurt or loss or grief around that, although people didn't talk about it openly. And Egon says the Protestant communities in Coot Hill really dwindled over these years. He says that the reason for this was that they didn't innovate or adapt in farming, and most of them were in farming, and that they didn't marry and have families. So he didn't have a sense that people moved out through fear. But all of that means that Coot Hill in 2006, when I met Egon, was a very different place than in 1956, around the time he was born. So the economy had been gutted for lots of different reasons. The sense of Ulsterness had become attenuated. The links to Northern Ireland had all but gone. It was more homogenous religiously and politically, and then neglected from Dublin, and that hadn't been balanced out by trade or investment from Belfast direction, which might have been the case pre-partition. So I'll finish with a quote from Egon, which sums all this up. He says, "The border was not a nice thing. It was not a nice thing, and it definitely separated you from your sense of identity, because if I turned my back on Armagh and Fermanagh, which, as I've explained to you, is where our heritage was, well, I'm facing into Westmeath and Meath, and certainly I'd have a sense of Irishness. That's a different thing, but I definitely don't feel a sense of belonging to Westmeath or Meath or Longford. Those areas don't mean the same. I wouldn't have links there." So these stories, as I've told them, were really only a part of what Kenny and Egon told me, and what they told me then is also only a part of their whole lived experience. But for me, one of the best things about the whole process was listening to people's stories was the way that those stories revealed those really rich and complex senses of identity that could change according to circumstance and over time. And at that point, and it's something I've worked on in the years since, it really confirmed what I'd always thought, that for all of us, our identities are much more than what our public narratives of Protestant, Catholic, Unionist, Nationalists seem to communicate. And really the border identities unfolding through these 80 stories are full of nuance, both because of the border and I think despite the border in some ways as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, we'll open out to the floor in just a moment, but I'm going to be very selfish and kick off with my own question. Cormac, as somebody who myself have been involved in various ways over a decade of centenaries projects over the last 10 years, looking at these 100th anniversaries that are coming up and that we're kind of finishing now in that decade, it just has always struck me, and it struck me again in your presentation, that the conversation around that centenary is so different than what we imagined it would be 10 years ago, simply because of what has happened since that we didn't anticipate with Brexit and the re-emergence of a border debate. So I wondered if you have any reflections on how, as a historian, looking back at that time has changed your perspective of what the present day situation and the conversations around that are, particularly, I guess, in your new work with Katie Hayward, which I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, so am I. It's not just about what I think about what's happened. Commemoration is never about the past, really. It's always about the present. And if we look at, when the whole decade of centenary starts, say, in 2012, there was actually a genuinely good atmosphere between North and South, between Ireland and Britain, and this is reflected, I thought, in a lot of the events that happened. There was acceptance of the Easter Rising by some Unionists. There was a lot of commemoration of the First World War, of the Somme and the sacrifice of unionism within the Somme. But Brexit definitely, put a schism in a lot of it. And we also have to remember that the centenary of partition happened during COVID as well, which I think allowed for governments to dodge a bullet because they didn't have to be in person or avoid being in person, as Michael D did in when was it August 21, was it, or September 21? So it has changed, but the commemoration is always about the present. It's never about the past, generally. And I'm a historian, so I'm obviously very interested in the past. But it's hard not to look at what's happened, particularly with Brexit and the parallels. And this is going to be drawn out in Katie in my book. Is a lot of the things that happened 100 years ago are happening right now. As you mentioned at the start, I do write a regular column for the Irish News, and one next week will be about Carson's misquoted the fools we were to trust the Tory party. But he probably was right in that respect, but it wasn't an anti-partitionist speech, as a lot of people have made out. So I think things have changed, but in terms of what's happened 10 years ago to where it is now. But that's because commemorations is always about the present. So what's happening currently does inform, and it is the reason why people do certain things during certain events. And even if you look at the political parties in the South, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, they have their political agenda. So does Sinn Féin. And anytime they have a commemoration event or they reflect on a commemoration event, it's always to put their best foot forward for today, not what happened 100 years ago.
And I was really struck by another quote that you shared during your presentation, which sounded like it was from today as well, like there can be no border without a customs border. And kind of like we were trying to say that for quite a while. And I was struck in both of your presentations actually about the really strong influence of psychological boundaries and borders at a political level, which then impacts on the economic level, but then very much in people's everyday lives, just in those small movements around a landscape, in their working lives and church lives and school lives and all those kinds of things. Bryonie, I was interested, obviously your research was taking place before Brexit, but I don't know, if you want to share, was there a nervousness around sharing those stories with you even at that time?
Yeah, very much so in certain areas. So there were maybe 5 out of the 80 interviewees who asked to be anonymous because of the types of things they were sharing and the context that they had come from. But I found that really interesting because I don't think it was only to do with personality. I think it was to do with geography. So South Armagh would have had a concentration of probably 3 who wanted to be anonymous. And actually, in a couple of parts of the Republic of Ireland as well. And it related to the Troubles and incidents in the Troubles and the sense of unresolved, ongoing power play. I think what those incidents had meant at the time had really reverberated through another 2 or 3 decades in those areas. And some of those things will be coming up again and in different shapes and forms for people now in a different way than they did when you talked to them. I'm going to stop hogging the time. Are there any questions from the floor, please? Right at the very back.
Just a quick one for Cormac here. So you mentioned about sort of the tension between the early Northern Ireland labour movement and the unionism of its day. Could you comment a bit more on that and why there's a tension that exists there, and if there's any resources that you would recommend around that? Could you share those? Thank you.
Well, there are a lot of resources that Emmett O'Connor probably is probably the preeminent historian on labour and partition, but there are lots of others. There's Graham Walker. There's abundance of historians that have written on labour history and focus on the. It was a very complex relationship. A lot of the leadership of the labour movement weren't unionists. A lot of them were Protestant, but they were not unionists. They actually felt that people like Craig and Carson and Andrews, Dawson Bates, Archell, all those guys were extremely wealthy and did not have the interests of the working class at heart. But Carson, actually, and Andrews in particular, were very skillful actually in actually getting working class Protestants on board and unifying Protestantism within Ulster to just focus on the constitutional issue, the main question. And as a result, Labour issues got sidelined, much to the disdain of many of the Labour leadership within Ulster. But then they change as well. It's interesting what Bryonie was saying about how identities change and over time. But like Harry Midgley was a committed Labour candidate, and every time he went to, and he used to get votes in Protestant and Catholic areas, and a lot of people say he used to change his the colour of his clothes from orange to green, depending on who he's looking for a vote from. But he definitely, as time went on and Northern Ireland became established and accepted, once the Labour movement accepted it was going to stay and it wasn't going anywhere, he became more unionist in outlook as well. So it's very complicated. They did try to avoid partition as a topic as often as possible, but circumstances did not allow them to. And also you had James Craig calling an election every time he perceived a threat to the border. So he always wanted every election to be about the border and the threat and the siege mentality. And this was much discussed as well by the Labour movement, that every election was always a referendum on the border when working class people, whether they're Protestant or Catholic, were still suffering on a day-to-day basis.
In the back row there, yeah.
Hi guys, thanks for that. I've already read your book, Cormac, so I don't need to buy it. But I'd recommend it to anybody.
Thank you.
I'm a PhD student at Queen's researching the history of tourism in the north, so Donegal and Antrim and Down and so on. And I often find that the big changes taking place in the 20th century, like mainly urbanization and changes in trade and commerce, almost seem to be more important to people's lives than the border, although of course the border plays a part in it. For example, in Fermanagh, cut off by the border, the towns of Newton Butler and Irvinstown did a lot better. They didn't have the competition of Belturbet or Clones to deal with. So I wondered if in your own research, these other themes like urbanization, depopulation of rural Ireland, changes in commerce and sort of modernization, cars generally, what part did that play in your own research? Because it seems to be really, really, really big in the history of modern Ireland. And of course the border intersects with it as well.
That's from me, I presume, is it? As I mentioned in my talk, that although the border had an impact, it probably didn't have as big an impact as some people would perceive in terms of even people's lives, but particularly in industry. Particularly when you look at the main industries that Northern Ireland was reliant on, say agriculture, shipbuilding, linen, were not really affected by north-south trade. It was always more east-west and even more internationally. Cars definitely, like the research I'm doing at the moment, when we look at, say, the customs barrier, railways was probably the main way people travelled throughout Ireland. I presume a lot of people have seen a map of the railway map of Ireland in 1921, the railway map of Ireland today, and basically the whole northwest of Ireland is bare now, and it was full of different railway lines, companies. But the 1920s, there was a big difference though in motor car take-up. In 1921, like the jump from I remember I think a quote in my book was that the amount of cars in Northern Ireland in 1921 to the amount of cars in 1927 had more than doubled, like in 6 years, and this just kept on higher and higher. So there was a reason why railways declined, not just because it was a malign government decision to get rid of railways. It was that people were using cars more regularly. But yeah, I think it's a good point you say about urbanisation. People obviously have, not just in the north but and the border areas, but throughout Ireland. Definitely has been a movement away from an agriculture-based economy, more towards industry and urbanised economy.
If I could just interject as well, a lot of my interviewees who were older talked about the devastating impact of the closure of railways, and a woman in Clonus talked about railway families leaving the town as like a funeral procession. That they came out with their furniture for the last time. You know, they had to move from their houses. I don't know where they were going. She didn't either. She was a child then. But that they went through the town and people mourned as they left. And that happened all around the border. Everybody, even if there wasn't a kind of funeral feel to the exit of railway families, there was a sense that we are now gutted. Like, people can't come in, they can't go out, we can't leave easily, the road infrastructure was poor. And so I think you're right, there's all of those global flows in terms of, you know, car ownership and urban consolidation and people having to move out of areas to work, but it always intersected with the border in very particular ways, and so that might happen, and then there's a cascading series of effects to do with the border, customs and violence. And Garrison in West Fermanagh, like almost the furthest west in Fermanagh, I think, we border, tiny little border village, used to be really big for tourism. And then with violence that all ended, and one of my interviews around there said that it used to be like Beijing with bicycles. On a Saturday, everybody from round about would come in, they'd go to the hotel, they'd use the bar, people would, you know, there would be lots of tourists, they'd all be fishing in Loch Melvin, but that all disappeared with violence, not necessarily with changes in tourism.
Hello, I think my question has been answered, but I'll continue anyway. I was born and bred in Belfast, and we always spent our holidays in the mid-60s and early 70s and all over Ireland, Donegal in particular. But I've since now, I live in County Cavan, well, Cavan and Meath border down there. I've been there 9 years, and I'm still astonished at many people I meet who have never crossed the border. And I say to them why, and it's not that to do with business or anything, just they don't seem to have any, you know, want, you know, why, what's up in the north, you know, and then I tell them all the good things. But I just, so when, I know your interviews were 16 years ago, whatever, did you still get that feeling that people just didn't want to cross the border either way, or they weren't interested, or, you know, my mother was from Emmy Vale, which is like basically on the border, but so we were used to crossing the border all the time. But still, I can meet people, like, I'm talking about people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, no. Why would I want to go over the border, you know? That's the phrase they'll use,
Yeah.
Go over the border.
Yeah, so I think with the people I spoke to who had grown up on or were still living on the border, worked at the border, they really differentiated themselves from everyone else who was further north and east in Northern Ireland or further west and south in the Republic of Ireland. So they would all have said, of course we crossed the border, and no matter how difficult and how frightening it would be, like, that's the way that it had, you know, we had connections on both sides, sometimes a need to cross as well. But they were really conscious then, when they moved out of their border areas and went elsewhere in Ireland, that people were shocked and horrified at the idea on both sides. And one guy told me a story. He had grown up near, like in South County Derry, near the border, and he was working in the Diocese of Derry and Raphoe as an adult after the peace process, and they were taking a church group drawn from kind of the Derry and east of Derry area to go to Donegal, and the discussion among the group was, how long will we need to travel there? You know, probably 3-4 hours, maybe 4 hours. Let's leave 4 hours. That might be enough time. And it took them like 45 minutes, and everyone was like, "Oh, it's that close." But that's it's a psychological barrier again.
I actually went on a trip quite recently with a group from where I live in County Cavan, and they were all people of my age, the silver-haired people, and we were going to Letterkenny, and that's what they were saying. How many hours does it take? And I went, it's only up the road. I think it only took us an hour or something, I can't remember, but they had this feeling that it was beyond.
Yeah.
But just actually, just on that, like I've lived in Dublin most of my adult life, and the amount of people that will go to Donegal for a weekend or a trip, and it's like it's 4.5 hours or 4 hours. It's the right place to get to. but they won't go to Down. Like I don't work for a Down tourism board, but the more like there's so many beautiful things in Down. It's a stunning county, and it's literally an hour up the road from Dublin, an hour and a half. I don't understand why people would always go to Donegal, which is such a pain to get to be honest, because there's no motorway. When you can go to Down, and it's almost as beautiful.
I know we started late, but if we take one more question just there before we finish.
If I could just ask a simple question. You know, we talked about the past, and I'm glad we talked about the past, but what's important is the future. Ireland has changed an awful lot. It's no longer the De Valera state. It's not even a Catholic state anymore. What can be done, or what do you think can be done, in order to change people's views, to let them see what the truth is, to make us go into some sort of a future where we can all be together? More to Cormac possibly than Bryonie.
Well, obviously there are people who are trying to convince people to be in United Ireland, and obviously it's other people are trying to convince people.
Irrespective of United Ireland, it has to be a united future for us. You know, you understand? Sorry.
Yeah, well,
just making a distinction.
I think it depends on what the objective is of the person who's trying to, what their objective is. You know, like I personally would like to see United Ireland, and what I would do is I would actually say, this is like the 26 counties is not the 26 counties it was 100 years ago. You know, it's not a Catholic state. It's not an impoverished country. It's a very tolerant society. It has changed so dramatically over the last 40 years. I grew up in the 80s. I was born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s. And Ireland no one would really want to be part of United Ireland in some respects, because it was a basket case in terms of economics. All my family who were older than me had to go abroad to get jobs. There was no jobs in Ireland. You know, it was. I remember going across the border. We didn't go across the border much during the Troubles, but occasionally we did. The roads are a lot better the north of the border than they were in the south. That's changed now. You know, so much has changed to Ireland. I think Ireland does a very bad job as a country in bigging itself up, in saying how things have progressed. Yes, of course, there's huge problems with housing and healthcare, but even our healthcare is a lot better than it was. The average living age now in Ireland is higher than it is in Britain. You know, and that wasn't the case. You know, so even though the HSE is seen as this very bad body and the NHS as silver bullets, well, we know that in the north that's not the case. You know, so there are a lot of good things about Ireland that we should be saying if we want a united Ireland. You know. And of course, it all has to be done with understanding people from different perspectives, and that's why I have a problem with certain nationalist voices who have, I wouldn't say triumphalists, but who will only will not concede the different viewpoints that are there at the moment, and what has to be done to adapt. If we were to ever have United Ireland, I would get rid of the national anthem and the flag in a heartbeat. You know, if we can have people together and actually, of course, have to accommodate the Britishness of a significant minority that would be in All Ireland. I don't know how else to answer that other than if I was looking for a United Ireland, this is how I would see in Ireland of the future. Does that in any way answer your question?
No, it is just what confuses me is why people can't start to look into the future. What can we do to stop the mindset of politicians, particularly here in Northern Ireland, who get elected because of bigotry and want to keep bigotry going?
Can I just, because there's a really interesting piece of research that just came out last week in relation to this, which quite clearly demonstrates that Northern Irish society, in particular, it's just on Northern Ireland, it's not an Ireland-wide study, but that people's attitudes and perspectives are much more broad than we think, and much more broad that are reflected in who is elected. And it's a really interesting study by the Social Change Initiative, so if anybody wants to look it up, please do. I know we've really run over time, and thank you for your patience. I do not want to ignore this gentleman who's been waiting patiently for a long time. So last question from him now.
Thank you very much. My name is Paul Robinson. I'm the historian of the Ulster Automobile Club. Question for Cormac. You touched on the boycotts just after partition. Motorsport is one of the rare sports that did split. And the split came directly because of the likes of the boycotts. Thomas Mull, as you mentioned, brought in the Motor Vehicle Races Act Northern Ireland, which was brought in to promote tourism and attract industry and to revive the motor trade, which had been devastated by the First World War and the boycotts, off the Belfast motor trade in particular. So it had a significant impact in the sense that the governing bodies changed. They still cooperated, but the impact was because of the boycott and the very different profile of Belfast motor ownership and Dublin. But the thing I'd like to ask you is, sorry, at the particular point, the emblems didn't change. Northern Ireland didn't adopt a unionist Ulster flag for its badges. It was the province of Ulster. So in your research, did you find that even where the sporting bodies did split, did they still remain very much cooperating and working together?
Well, in some sports. Motorsports, but I think motorsports is, although it's split, the profile of the people in Dublin involved in motorsport were similar to the people in Belfast. There was a lot of unionists, actually, members of the RIAC. Like Henry McLaughlin, actually, who was first president of the FAI, he was heavily involved in motorsport as well. And he believed in United Ireland, but within the British Empire, and a lot of them actually said that as well. Let's be united. If you look at, say, soccer and rugby and so on, they had this home nations thing, so that there was a certain Britishness to it anyway, in terms of how competitions were run. Soccer, they actually got on okay. They should have actually reached an agreement in 1924 and 1932 to come back together again. And there wasn't that much bad blood, really. If you look at James Wilton, he was the president of the IFA when Leinster left the IFA, and he was an Ulster Unionist. He was a Lord Mayor of Derry, but he was quite a reasonable guy. He tried to make enough changes for Dublin to come in, but it gone too far at that stage. And I don't think there was that much bitterness there. Probably the most bitter sport in terms of the personnel was athletics, and that still is. You will talk to people who will say they're from this body or that body, and they still don't talk to each other. It's that bitter. That was way more bitter than the soccer split. The soccer split, there was a number of attempts, genuine attempts, to get them back together again, but they did drift apart, and it didn't help the fact that both jurisdictions were picking players from both jurisdictions as well, particularly to the IFA. That often it was down to personalities and down to the makeup of governing bodies where they came from. So I accept motor racing is different. That it was the kind of geography of Ireland that made it split in some ways, but there still was a lot of cooperation in terms of all Ireland rallies and so on. Both bodies worked with each other, whereas that wasn't, like, athletics is definitely the sport where the division was the most bitter, and in some ways that still endures.
Thank you, everyone, for spending the time with us today. Thank you, Cormac and Bryonie, for sharing your papers and those extra reflections and insights. That's us, finished. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.